The scorching summer sun beat down on Utica, Montana territory, as Josephine Byrne stood before the entrance to the town's annual summer dance, her heart pounding against her chest like a wild Mustang. The year was 1879, and at 22 years old she had finally mustered the courage to attend the most anticipated social event of the season, only to face the cruel sting of rejection. "I'm sorry, Miss Byrne," the portly doorkeeper said, not looking sorry at all, "but you ain't on the list." The Wilkerson family was quite specific about who's welcome and who ain't. Josephine clutched her carefully mended blue dress, the one she'd spent 3 nights altering to hide the worn patches at the elbows. "There must be some mistake. I received an invitation last week." "No mistake, miss," the doorkeeper replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Mrs. Wilkerson heard about your pa's debt to the bank, says she don't want no paupers at her daughter's celebration." Heat rushed to Josephine's cheeks, not from the summer warmth, but from the humiliation burning through her. The music from inside the dance hall seemed to mock her, the laughter and conversation filtering through the open windows like salt on a fresh wound. "I understand," she managed to say, though her throat felt tight. "Good evening, then." Josephine turned away, blinking rapidly to hold back tears that threatened to fall. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. 3 steps down the wooden boardwalk, she heard a deep voice behind her. "Seems to me the finest lady in Utica is leaving before the dancing's even begun." She turned to find herself face to face with Yates Irving, the tall, broad-shouldered cowboy who'd arrived in town last spring to work at the Thompson Ranch. His dark hair fell in waves beneath his hat, and his eyes, warm and brown as coffee, regarded her with a gentleness that made her heart skip. "Mr. Irving," she acknowledged, trying to sound composed despite the embarrassment still coloring her cheeks. "Miss Byrne," he tipped his hat, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "I couldn't help but overhear shame about that list." "Yes, well," Josephine straightened her shoulders. "I suppose some parties aren't meant for everyone." Yates glanced at the dance hall, then back to her. The fiddle inside struck up a waltz, the melody drifting out into the evening air. "May I have this dance?" he asked suddenly, extending his hand. Josephine stared at him in confusion. "But the dance is in there, and the music's out here," he replied with a smile that reached his eyes. "I reckon the stars make a finer ceiling than any painted boards anyway." For a moment, Josephine hesitated. People would talk if they saw her dancing in the street with Yates Irving. But then again, they were already talking, weren't they? About her father's debts, about their struggling farm, about how she'd been turned away like some beggar at the door. "I'd be honored, Mr. Irving," she said at last, placing her hand in his. He led her a few steps away from the hall, just far enough that the light from the lanterns cast a soft glow around them, but not so close that they'd draw immediate attention. With gentle confidence, he placed his hand at her waist, holding her other hand in his, and began to guide her in time with the music. "I've wanted to ask you to dance since I first saw you at church last Easter," he admitted, his voice low and sincere. "Never seemed to find the right moment." "And you thought this was it?" she asked, unable to help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Sometimes the best moments find us when we least expect them, Miss Byrne." As they moved together beneath the vast Montana sky, Josephine felt the sting of rejection begin to fade. Yates danced with surprising grace for a man who spent his days in the saddle, and when he smiled down at her, she felt as though they were the only 2 people in Utica. From inside the hall, Mrs. Wilkerson's daughter Rebecca noticed the pair through the window, her eyes narrowing as she watched Josephine Byrne dancing with the handsome cowboy she herself had been hoping to charm that evening. "Mother," she hissed, grabbing Mrs. Wilkerson's arm. "Look at that shameless display." After we turned her away, Mrs. Wilkerson peered out the window, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The nerve of that girl! Edward," she called to her husband, "go put a stop to that unseemly spectacle." Outside, unaware of the brewing storm, Josephine found herself laughing as Yates twirled her beneath the stars. "You're quite the dancer for a cowboy, Mr. Irving." "My mother insisted all her sons learn," he explained. "Said a man ought to be as comfortable in a dance hall as he is on a horse." "A wise woman," Josephine replied, feeling lighter than she had in months. Their moment of joy was short-lived as Mr. Wilkerson pushed through the dance hall doors, his face flushed with indignation. Irving, he barked. This is a private event. Take your activities elsewhere. Yates stopped dancing but kept his hand protectively at Josephine's waist. We're not disturbing your party, Mr. Wilkerson, just enjoying the music. You're on my property, Wilkerson insisted, and I want you both gone. Several faces appeared at the windows, curious onlookers eager to witness the confrontation. Josephine felt her humiliation returning tenfold. Mr. Irving, she whispered, perhaps we should go. Yates looked down at her, then back at Wilkerson. You're right, he said quietly to Josephine. Then louder, Mr. Wilkerson, your hospitality is as generous as your heart is big. We'll be on our way. The sarcasm wasn't lost on Wilkerson, whose face reddened further, but before he could respond, Yates had taken Josephine's hand and was leading her away from the dance hall. I apologize for that, Yates said once they were out of earshot. I didn't mean to cause you more embarrassment. You didn't, Josephine assured him, though her cheeks still burned. I'm grateful for your kindness. They walked in silence for a moment, the sounds of the dance fading behind them. The main street of Utica was quieter now, with most townsfolk either at the dance or home for the evening. A few lanterns glowed from shop windows, casting long shadows across the dirt road. Would you allow me to walk you home? Yates asked. It's nearly 3 miles to our farm, Josephine said. I've got 2 good legs, he replied with a smile, and I can think of no better company for the journey. Josephine hesitated. It wasn't proper to be alone with a man she barely knew, especially after dark. But there was something about Yates Irving that made her feel safe, something in the respectful way he held himself and the gentle humor in his eyes. Actually, she said, making a sudden decision, I'm not ready to go home just yet. Would you mind very much if we sat by the creek for a while? I find the sound of water soothing after difficult moments. If Yates was surprised by her suggestion, he didn't show it. I'd be honored, Miss Byrne. They made their way to the small creek that ran along the eastern edge of town, where a fallen log provided a convenient seat beneath a stand of cottonwoods. The night was warm, and the water gurgled peacefully over rocks worn smooth by time. I should thank you, Josephine said as they settled on the log, a respectable distance between them, for salvaging what could have been a thoroughly miserable evening. No thanks needed, Yates replied, though I admit I had selfish reasons. Oh. I've been trying to find a way to talk to you properly since I arrived in Utica. He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. Figured dancing outside the hall might not be the most conventional approach, but it worked. Josephine laughed softly. It certainly did. As the night deepened around them, they talked. Yates told her about growing up on a ranch in Wyoming, about his 3 older brothers, and how they'd taught him to ride almost before he could walk. He spoke of his dream to have a place of his own someday, a modest spread with good horses and enough cattle to build a future. In turn, Josephine shared stories of her mother, who had died 5 years earlier, and how she'd been trying to keep their farm running while her father struggled with both grief and the bottle. She spoke of her love for books, how the town's small lending library had been her sanctuary during the hardest times. It's not easy, she admitted, looking out at the water. The bank's threatening to foreclose if we can't make the next payment. I'm sorry to hear that, Yates said, his voice gentle. Is there no way to raise the money? Father's trying to sell some of our stock, but prices are low right now, she sighed. And he's too proud to accept help even when it's offered. They fell into companionable silence, listening to the creek and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. When Josephine shivered slightly in the night air, Yates removed his jacket and offered it to her. I couldn't possibly, she protested. I insist, he said. My ma would have my hide if she knew I let a lady catch a chill on my account. Reluctantly, Josephine accepted the jacket, wrapping it around her shoulders. It smelled of leather, horses, and something distinctly masculine that she found oddly comforting. It's getting late, she said finally, though she was loath to end their conversation. I should be getting home, of course. Yates stood, offering his hand to help her up. I'll walk you. The journey to the Byrne farm took them through stretches of open country bathed in moonlight. They talked easily as they walked, and Josephine found herself laughing more than she had in months. There was something about Yates that put her at ease, as though they'd known each other for years rather than hours. As they approached the farmhouse, a small, weathered structure that had seen better days, Josephine slowed her steps, reluctant for the evening to end. "Thank you, Mr. Irving," she said, removing his jacket and handing it back to him. "For everything." "Yates," he corrected gently. "Please call me Yates." "Yates," she repeated, testing the name. "Then you must call me Josephine." "Josephine," he said, and the way he spoke her name made her heart flutter. "Would it be forward of me to ask if I might call on you properly, perhaps this Sunday after church?" She smiled, warmth spreading through her despite the night chill. "I would like that very much." A light appeared in one of the farmhouse windows, and a moment later the front door opened to reveal Thomas Byrne, Josephine's father, silhouetted against the lamplight. "Josephine, that you?" He called, his voice carrying the slight slur that had become all too familiar. "Yes, father," she called back. "I'll be right in." Yates stepped back respectfully. "Good night, Josephine. I'll see you Sunday." "Good night, Yates," she replied, and with a final smile she turned and walked toward the house, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Sunday couldn't come fast enough for Josephine. She found herself watching the clock, counting the hours until church. When the day finally arrived, she put on her best dress, a modest green cotton that brought out the hazel in her eyes, and coaxed her father into shaving and putting on his good shirt. "Ain't seen you this excited for church in a while," Thomas Byrne observed as they walked the dusty road to town. "Wouldn't have anything to do with that cowboy who walked you home, would it?" Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. Irving was kind enough to escort me after the dance. That's all." "MMHMM," her father replied, not convinced but not pressing further. The small white church at the edge of town was already filling when they arrived. Josephine tried not to be too obvious as she scanned the pews for Yates, her heart sinking a little when she didn't see him. Had he changed his mind? Just as the service was about to begin, the door opened and Yates slipped in, looking slightly disheveled but handsome in a clean white shirt and dark trousers. His eyes found hers immediately, and the smile that spread across his face was enough to make Josephine's breath catch. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the sunlight, Josephine felt a now familiar presence at her side. "Good morning, Josephine," Yates said, his voice warming her more than the summer sun. "You look lovely today." "Thank you," she replied, conscious of her father watching them with interest. "Yates, this is my father, Thomas Byrne. Father, this is Yates Irving." The two men shook hands, sizing each other up in that way men do. "Mr. Byrne," Yates said respectfully, "I've heard good things about your farm. I understand you raise some fine horses." Thomas straightened a bit at the compliment. "Used to, haven't had much luck with breeding lately." "I'd be interested in seeing them sometime," Yates said. "I've got a bit of experience with horse breeding from my time in Wyoming." Josephine watched in amazement, as her father, who had barely spoken to anyone outside of necessity in months, engaged in a lengthy conversation with Yates about bloodlines and training methods. When Yates finally asked if he might take Josephine for a walk around town, Thomas gave his approval with surprising ease. "Don't keep her too long," he said. "Got chores waiting at home." As they strolled down Main Street, Josephine couldn't help but notice the curious glances from townsfolk. Word of their impromptu dance outside the Wilkerson party had spread, as news always did in small towns like Utica. "People are staring," she murmured. "Let them," Yates replied with a shrug. "I don't much care what people think." "That's easy to say when you're not the one they're whispering about." Yates stopped walking, turning to face her. "Josephine, if my attention is causing you discomfort—" "No," she said quickly, surprising herself with her vehemence. "No, it's not that. I'm not used to being noticed." His expression softened. "Then the people of Utica must be blind, because you're the most noticeable woman I've ever met." They continued their walk, eventually finding themselves at Fitzgerald's General Store. Yates insisted on buying Josephine a small bag of peppermint candies, a luxury she rarely indulged in. "To sweeten an already sweet day," he said as he handed them to her, making her laugh at the cheesy line. Their Sunday walks became a ritual over the following weeks. Sometimes they would stroll through town, other times they would walk along the creek where they'd first talked. Yates began helping out at the Byrne farm during his days off from the Thompson Ranch, fixing fences and offering advice on the horses. Thomas, initially wary, grew to appreciate the young man's work ethic and knowledge. One warm August evening, as Yates and Josephine sat on the porch of the farmhouse after a day of hard work, he broached a subject that had been on his mind. "Your father mentioned the banks giving him trouble about the mortgage," he said carefully. Josephine sighed. "Yes, we have until the end of September to make a payment or they'll foreclose." Yates was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been saving, not much, but enough to help." "I'd be willing to—" "No," Josephine interrupted, her pride flaring. "We can't accept your money." "It wouldn't be charity," Yates insisted. "Think of it as an investment. I believe in this farm, Josephine, and in you." The sincerity in his eyes made it hard for her to maintain her resolve. I'll talk to father about it," she conceded. The next day, however, brought unexpected news. Mrs. Thompson, the wife of Yates's employer, had passed away suddenly in the night. The funeral was set for the following day, and all of Utica turned out to pay respects to one of the town's oldest and most respected families. Josephine stood beside Yates at the graveside, her heart aching for the grief etched on Mr. Thompson's weathered face. He was a good man who had always treated his workers fairly, and seeing him so broken was difficult. After the service, Mr. Thompson approached Yates. "Son, can I have a word?" Yates nodded, squeezing Josephine's hand before following his employer a short distance away. When he returned a few minutes later, his expression was troubled. "What is it?" Josephine asked. "Mr. Thompson's selling the ranch," Yates explained quietly. "Says he can't bear to stay without Mrs. Thompson. He's moving to San Francisco to live with his daughter." "Oh no," Josephine breathed. "What will you do?" Yates ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "He's offered to sell me his breeding stock at a fair price, says I've got a good eye for horses and it'd be a shame to see the bloodlines scattered." "That's wonderful," Josephine said, though she could tell there was more. "It would be if I had somewhere to keep them." Yates looked out over the rolling Montana landscape. "I've been saving for my own place, but I'm nowhere near having enough for land." An idea struck Josephine like lightning. "Our farm, we have the space, the stables." "Josephine, no, listen," she pressed, excitement building. "Father knows horses, but he hasn't had the funds to invest in good stock. You have the knowledge and the opportunity to acquire quality animals. Together, we could build something." Yates studied her face, hope and caution warring in his eyes. "It's not that simple. Your father has always respected a good business proposition," she finished. "Let me talk to him." That evening, Josephine presented the idea to her father. To her surprise, Thomas listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about Yates's experience and the quality of Thompson's stock. "Boy's got a good head on his shoulders," Thomas admitted. "And Lord knows we need a miracle to keep this place." "It wouldn't be a miracle, Father," Josephine said. "It would be hard work and a fair partnership." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Bring him by tomorrow, we'll talk terms." The following day, Yates arrived at the Byrne farm earlier than usual, his nervousness evident in the way he kept adjusting his hat. Josephine met him at the gate, her own stomach fluttering with anticipation. "He's in the barn," she said, leading the way. "He's been up since dawn, clearing space in the stables." Thomas Byrne stood in the center of the barn, surveying the space with a critical eye. When he saw Yates, he nodded once in greeting. "Irving, Josephine tells me you've got a proposition." For the next hour, the two men discussed details: how many horses, what percentage of profits each would receive, what improvements would need to be made to the property. Josephine listened, occasionally offering suggestions, her respect for Yates growing as she witnessed his clear-headed business sense. "There's one more thing," Thomas said finally, fixing Yates with a hard stare. "This ain't just about horses, is it, boy?" Yates straightened, meeting the older man's gaze. "No, sir, it's not. You've been calling on my daughter for weeks now. What are your intentions?" "Father," Josephine protested, mortified. Yates held up a hand, never breaking eye contact with Thomas. "It's a fair question." "Mr. Byrne, I care deeply for your daughter. I have since the moment I first saw her. If she'll have me, I intend to court her properly, with the hope that someday she might consent to be my wife." The bluntness of his declaration left Josephine breathless. They hadn't spoken of marriage, though she couldn't deny she'd thought of it, dreamed of it even. Thomas studied Yates for a long moment, then turned to his daughter. "Josephine, this what you want?" With her heart pounding in her ears, Josephine looked at Yates, at his honest face, his steady eyes, the way he stood tall and unafraid before her father, and knew her answer without a doubt. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." Thomas nodded once. "Then we have an agreement on both counts." The transformation of the Byrne farm began immediately. Yates moved into the small cabin at the edge of the property that had once housed ranch hands when the farm was more prosperous. He and Thomas traveled to the Thompson Ranch to select the horses, 5 mares and a stallion, all with excellent bloodlines. As autumn painted the Montana landscape in gold and crimson, Josephine watched her father come back to life. He drank less, worked more, and for the first time in years spoke of the future with hope rather than resignation. She found herself falling into a comfortable rhythm with Yates, working alongside him during the day and sitting with him on the porch in the evenings, planning and dreaming. The first test of their new partnership came when Rebecca Wilkerson's father arrived at the farm one afternoon, his expensive horse and polished boots looking out of place among the practical surroundings. "Byrne," he greeted Thomas curtly, "I understand you're expanding your operation." "What of it?" Thomas replied. Instantly on guard, Wilkerson dismounted, casting a disparaging glance around the farm. "I thought I should warn you. The bank's not likely to look favorably on you taking on new ventures when you're already behind on your mortgage." "Our business with the bank is our concern," Thomas said. "Perhaps," Wilkerson agreed with a thin smile. "But as a member of the bank's board, I feel it's my duty to express concerns about risky investments." Yates, who had been repairing a fence nearby, approached. "Mr. Wilkerson," he said, his voice level despite the anger Josephine could see in his eyes. "Is there something specific you're looking for today?" "Just passing by," Wilkerson replied, his gaze sliding dismissively over Yates. "Though I am curious about these grand plans I've been hearing about, a cowhand and a failing farmer thinking they can compete with established breeders. It's almost amusing." Josephine stepped forward, her chin lifted. "If you've come to mock us, Mr. Wilkerson, you've wasted your time. We're too busy building something to entertain your petty games." Wilkerson's eyes narrowed at her boldness. "Miss Byrne, I would advise you to remember your place. Your family's standing in this community is precarious at best." "And I would advise you," Yates said, stepping slightly in front of Josephine, "to remember that you're on Byrne property, uninvited and unwelcome." For a tense moment, the four stood in silence, the autumn wind rustling the dry grass around them. Finally, Wilkerson turned back to his horse. "Don't say I didn't try to warn you," he said as he mounted. "The bank's patience has limits." After he rode away, Thomas turned to Yates and Josephine, his face grim. "He'll make trouble for us at the bank." "Let him try," Yates replied. "We've got a solid plan and good stock. If the bank in Utica won't work with us, there are others." Despite Yates's confidence, the encounter cast a shadow over their efforts. True to Wilkerson's warning, the bank called in the buy-in mortgage early, giving them just 30 days to pay in full. "It's not right," Josephine fumed as she, her father, and Yates sat at the kitchen table that evening trying to make sense of the bank's letter. "They can't just change the terms like this." "They can if Wilkerson's pulling strings," Thomas said tiredly. "Man's had it in for me since I outbid him on this land 20 years ago." Yates had been quiet, studying the letter with a frown. "We need more time. The mares won't foal until spring, and even with my savings and what you've put aside, we're short." "What if we sold the stallion?" Josephine suggested. "He's worth the most. And without him, we've got no breeding program," Yates pointed out gently. "We'd be right back where we started." They sat in discouraged silence, the lamplight casting long shadows across the worn table. Finally, Thomas stood. "I'm going to bed," he announced. "We'll figure something out tomorrow." After he left, Josephine and Yates remained at the table, their hands finding each other's in the dim light. "We'll find a way," Yates promised. "I'm not giving up." "Neither am I," Josephine replied, squeezing his hand. "Not on the farm, and certainly not on us." The next few weeks were a flurry of activity as they explored every possible avenue to raise the needed funds. They sold equipment they could spare, took odd jobs in town, and even approached other ranchers about potential partnerships. Each night, they would gather at the kitchen table to count their progress, the stack of bills growing slowly but steadily. As the deadline approached, however, it became clear they would fall short. 3 days before the bank was set to foreclose, Josephine found Yates in the barn, staring at the horses with a distant expression. "I've been thinking," he said when she approached. "My brother in Wyoming, he's been wanting to expand his breeding program. He'd give us a fair price for the stallion." "Yates, no," Josephine protested. "That stallion is your future, our future." He turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Josephine, this farm is our future. We can rebuild the breeding program, find another stallion eventually. But if we lose this land, we lose everything." She knew he was right, but the thought of him sacrificing his dream for her family's land filled her with both gratitude and guilt. "There has to be another way." "If there is, we haven't found it," Yates said, "and time's running out." That evening, Yates sent a telegram to his brother, offering the stallion. The response came the next morning. His brother would take the horse and pay the price Yates asked, but it would take him at least a week to arrange for the funds and transportation. "We don't have a week," Thomas said grimly when Yates shared the news. "No," Yates agreed, "but we might have a bargaining chip. If I can show the bank that the money's coming, they might grant an extension." Early the next morning, the day before the foreclosure, Yates rode into town to speak with the bank manager. Josephine spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation, alternating between practical tasks around the farm and moments of quiet prayer. When Yates finally returned in the late afternoon, the expression on his face told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke. "They won't budge," he said, dismounting slowly as though the weight of defeat sat heavy on his shoulders. "Wilkerson made sure of that." Josephine felt tears prick at her eyes but blinked them back fiercely. "So that's it. We lose everything tomorrow, not everything," Yates said, taking her hands. "Never everything as long as we have each other." That night, the three of them sat on the porch, watching as the sunset painted the sky in spectacular shades of orange and pink. Despite the somber mood, there was a strange peace in accepting what couldn't be changed. "This land's been Byrne land for 2 decades, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Raised my family here, buried my wife here." He looked at Yates and Josephine. "Hope to see grandchildren playing in that yard someday." Josephine reached over to squeeze her father's hand, her throat too tight for words. "It's a beautiful piece of land," Yates agreed, "worth fighting for." They sat in silence as darkness fell, each lost in their own thoughts. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Who would be calling at this hour? Thomas wondered, standing to peer into the darkness. 3 riders emerged from the shadows, and as they drew closer, Josephine recognized the center figure as Mr. Thompson, Yates's former employer. Beside him rode Sheriff Miller and, surprisingly, the bank manager, Mr. Peterson. "Evening, Byrne," Thompson called as they reined in their horses. "Hope it's not too late for visitors." Thomas stepped forward, suspicion evident in his stance. "What's this about?" Thompson dismounted, followed by the others. "Heard about your troubles with the bank, thought I might have a solution." Over the next hour, seated around the Byrne's kitchen table, Thompson laid out his proposal. He had decided not to move to San Francisco after all. Too many people, too much noise, he explained, but he still didn't want the responsibility of running his ranch. "I've been watching what you're doing here," he said to Yates and Thomas. "Smart idea, focusing on breeding rather than trying to run a full cattle operation. I'd like to invest by a share of your business with enough cash to clear the bank debt and give you operating funds for the first year." Josephine could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Why would you do this?" she asked. Thompson's weathered face softened. "My Martha always spoke highly of you, Miss Byrne, said you were one of the few people in town who visited her regularly, never mind that we were better off than most." He turned to Yates. "And this young man was the best hand I ever hired, got a good head for business and horses both." The bank manager, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "I should mention that Mr. Thompson has considerable influence with our board, more than certain other members." "Wilkerson," Thomas said flatly. Thompson nodded. "Edwards always had more ambition than sense. Been trying to piece together a big enough spread to impress those Eastern investors he's always talking about. Your land would connect his northern and southern pastures quite nicely. So that's why he's been so determined to see us fail," Josephine said, the pieces finally falling into place. "Likely so," Thompson agreed. But I think your idea for a breeding operation has more merit than anything Edwards cooked up, and I'd rather put my money on people I trust." By the time the visitors left that night, they had the outline of an agreement. Thompson would buy a 30% share in the newly formed Byrne and Irving Horse Breeding Company, with an option for Thomas and Yates to buy him out over time if they chose. As they stood on the porch watching the three men ride away, Thomas turned to his daughter and Yates, a smile breaking across his face for the first time in days. "Well," he said, "seems like we've got a future to plan." The following spring, the Byrne farm was transformed. New fencing surrounded expanded paddocks, the barn had been repaired and expanded, and the first foals from their mares pranced on spindly legs in the sunshine. Thompson's investment had not only saved the farm, but allowed them to realize the vision that Yates and Josephine had first imagined that day after the funeral. On a perfect May afternoon, with the wildflowers carpeting the surrounding hills and the scent of new grass in the air, Yates led Josephine to the creek where they had first truly talked, the night after the dance where she'd been turned away. "I have something to ask you," he said, suddenly looking as nervous as he had the day he'd approached her father about their partnership. "Yes," Josephine said immediately, a smile blooming on her face. Yates laughed. "I haven't asked the question yet." "The answer will still be yes," she assured him, her eyes bright with happiness. Nevertheless, he knelt before her, taking her hand in his. "Josephine Byrne, I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing outside that dance hall, too proud to let them see you cry. I love your strength, your kindness, your fierce loyalty to those you care about. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said again, pulling him to his feet and into her arms. "1,000 times yes." They were married in June, in the small white church where they had reconnected that Sunday after the dance. The entire town turned out for the occasion, even the Wilkersons, though they sat in the back and left immediately after the ceremony. As Yates and Josephine shared their first dance as husband and wife at the reception held on the Byrne farm, he whispered in her ear, "Remember our first dance, outside the hall under the stars?" "How could I forget?" she replied, leaning into his embrace. "It was the beginning of everything." "No," Yates corrected gently, his eyes full of love as he gazed down at her. "It was just the first step of many, and we've got a lifetime of dancing ahead of us." As the years passed, the Byrne and Irving breeding operation flourished, becoming known throughout the territory for the quality of its horses. Josephine and Yates welcomed 3 children, 2 sons, and a daughter who grew up learning both their father's way with horses and their mother's love of books. And every year, on the anniversary of the night they first danced outside the Wilkerson dance, Yates would take Josephine's hand and lead her outside under the Montana stars, where they would waltz to music only they could hear, remembering how a moment of rejection had led to a lifetime of love.